Senator from Wyoming.
Thank you, Mr. President. I ask unanimous consent that the quorum call be vitiated.
Without objection.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, I come to the floor today to oppose the Kigali Amendment. That's the United Nations treaty that is under consideration in this body today. 2 years ago, this body, the United States Senate, passed a bipartisan bill. The goal of the bill was to reduce hydrofluorocarbons, HFCs, and do it domestically. We passed it, signed into law. Now, these HFCs, these are gases that are used in refrigerators, air conditioners, fire extinguishers, and in insulation. They also contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. So I worked in a bipartisan way to build a coalition of senators to pass the bill. 2 years later, here we are. The law is now in effect in the United States. Parts of the law are still being implemented. Yet now, today, we are being asked to sign on to treaty obligations at the United Nations that I believe are solely unnecessary. We've already passed bipartisan legislation to reduce HFC consumption, and it has already become the law of the land. Many of the benefits and the jobs that are being touted are U.S. innovations. And it's a result of our domestic legislation, not ratification of some UN treaty. We did it here. We did it right. I say we don't need to get entangled now in another United Nations treaty. Our own law can be amended if we would like. It can be repealed. It can be replaced. Depending on the impact and cost, the U.S. can make changes quickly. It's much harder, if not impossible, to do it with an international treaty. In fact, when you take a look at the Kigali Treaty, an amendment, there's actually no way to withdraw from it if we ratify and join in. When I take a look at this, it is especially bad because it doubles down on the practice of treating China, yes, China, as a developing country, and the key word here is developing. China's not a developing country. But this treaty says they are a developing country, and it makes a big difference in terms of the treaty and the way that China is treated internationally, because it gives China special treatment. And I will tell you, Mr. President, they don't deserve the kind of treatment that they would get with this. Under this treaty, China would get an extra 10 years, an extra decade to produce HFCs. Well, this places us, the United States, at a competitive disadvantage to China for 10 additional years. Interestingly, and I think surprisingly to people, that when they hear this, the U.S. would also be expected to give more American taxpayer dollars to a UN, United Nations, multilateral fund that's set aside to help developing nations. The key word here is, again, developing, and they want to treat China like a developing country. So it would send more U.S. dollars to China because they have access to this UN multilateral fund. Well, the United States is already the largest contributor to this fund. We've given over $1 billion of American taxpayer dollars to this United Nations so-called, it's a slush fund. But what about China? Have they contributed? Oh, no, Mr. President. China has actually taken $1.4 billion out of the fund that we have contributed to, because we're a developed nation and China is still, theoretically and legally by this treaty, still developing. When you take a look at the debt that we have as a nation, and you go and talk to any high school class or junior high school class, as I've done in Wyoming, did it in Wheatland, Wyoming, with a bunch of really smart kids, and they say, okay, when we have this debt, who are we borrowing the money from? You know what they say? Oh, we're borrowing it from China. So we borrow from China to give to the multilateral fund under this Montreal Protocol. And what happens then? The fund gives it to China. The U.S. borrows from China, we give it to the United Nations, the United Nations gives it to China. So we're further in debt to China. This makes zero sense. Even to the high school kids, it makes zero sense. With ratification of the Kigali Amendment to the UN treaty, more and more American taxpayer dollars will be going to communist China. Now, this is happening despite the fact that everyone knows that China is not a developing country and shouldn't be labeled as a developing country or treated as a developing country. China is the second largest economy in the world. China is our greatest economic and geopolitical rival. The United States should not let China play by a special set of rules that are designed to give a helping hand to truly developing nations. China doesn't fit. But this is exactly what is outlined in the Kigali Amendment, and that is why I have filed at the desk an amendment to what is being discussed on the floor of the Senate today. My amendment says the United States will not ratify this treaty until China is defined, rightly, as a developed country. Not a developing country, but a developed country, because they truly are. No special treatment for China, period. Everyone should stand up for that in this body, each and every member. So senators have some decisions to make. Are we going to vote to allow China to play by a whole different set of rules? We're going to vote to put America at a competitive disadvantage. We're going to vote to continue to give American taxpayer dollars to China. Now, members of my colleagues and friends on the other side of the aisle say, oh, it's not about China, this is about HFC, the chemicals involved. Again, we have already passed bipartisan legislation to reduce HFCs. The law is still going into effect. There is no excuse for any senator to give China a handout at the expense of the American taxpayers and the American hardworking families. No excuse whatsoever. Mr. President, we should not be outsourcing our environmental policy. I urge my colleagues to support my amendment and once again say no special treatment for China. Thank you, Mr. President, and I yield the floor.
Clerk will call the roll.
Ms. Baldwin.